Hello guys, David Vose here. Oh boy, is it a beautiful day here in Red Mesa, New Mexico. A lot of snow, still cool, cloudy. Supposed to warm up in a couple days, maybe start melting some of the snow off. Friends, I want to get right in to some things that I want to talk to you guys about today. Oh my goodness. You know, we've done some things that I think are pretty eye-opening. We've talked about a lot of different things in the videos that we've been doing. But I think this video, to me, is one of the most ridiculous cover-ups that I've ever heard of, that I could even have imagined. I mean, I've heard people say, well, we lost 1,000 years of our history. We're missing 1,000 years, or we got too much, there's 1,000 years too much. We already had the 1,000-year reign of Christ. But that's all speculation. I've heard, and it's provably wrong. We have libraries. We have history books. It's like people saying, well, I believe in the writings of Jesus or the red letters, but I don't believe in the rest of the Gospels. Well, how could you trust the red letters that were written by Luke and Mark if you don't trust Luke and Mark? So there are things that you hear that are just speculation or ridiculous concepts. But what I'm about to share with you is, I don't know any other word but flabbergasting. It is the truth. And when you hear this truth, it will boggle your mind. But it will also put together for you in your mind some of the missing pieces. And with this new information, we might be able to figure some of this stuff out. Because we have a lot of questions. Are the founding fathers good people? Are Freemasons good? Well, they can't be. All these people today that are Freemasons are evil. I mean, they got this plot going on to take over the world. Secret societies. How could they be good? Well, they weren't always that. They were knights to protect the Holy Grail. But there is a group of people. Now, listen, they're in the Bible. The Bible says there will be 10 horns that will come up as the one world government in the latter days. What are the 10 horns? Well, they came out of and they came onto the beast of Rome. Well, Rome lasted until about 400 AD. And then the Visigoths and the Lombards and the Hurlus and the Vandals, which all of these things I'm mentioning are tribes, Germanic tribes. And there are 10 Germanic tribes. And those are the 10 horns. So when people look at Europe, they try to say, well, maybe it's NATO. Well, I guess there's more than 10 or less than 10. Well, maybe someday they'll have only 10. Or maybe it's, they come up with the UN or something, but it's got too many people in it. So nobody can figure this out. Well, all of Europe, all the way to Moscow, the entire northern area, the British northern areas up in there, were all taken over by 10 tribes. And that's what the 10 horns are. And they're basically the Germanic tribes that Hitler tried to bring back and revive. And they're, a lot of people think that he didn't do it. He didn't manage it. But as we've said, the Germans actually won World War II. And they're actually in charge right now. And that's why Klaus Schwab is right now in control of this new compliance. You will comply, whole thing. Yeah, King Charles, whoever the guy is, he's a king of the British. But this British throne was taken over by this Germanic tribes, Vlad the Impaler, the Bavarians. And so anyway, I don't want to go into that too much, but it is necessary to understand in our story that these northern 10 tribes are the bad guys. And they're the ones going to start this one world government. They're the ones pulling off this hoax over there in that little land south of Lebanon. But now, before they took over, before they came down and took over France and Spain and the Iberian or the Hebrew Peninsula and the Druids and all of this Gaul and most of Europe used to be descendants of Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. I know that sounds crazy. We've done so many different videos on this, and it's well documented. It's talked about in famous books that you might have heard of, like Dan Brown. They aren't going to let you know the whole story. They put it in some sort of a conspiracy format, like in a novel, and they just tell you bits and pieces that really just obfuscate all these real facts that they don't want you to know. If any of this information gets out, if anybody's allowed to see this video, and it gets out there and people start understanding it, then there might be books written, and then they'll have to do something to take parts of this information, skew it, and make it look ridiculous, and hide the stuff that's proof and burn it. I remember just a few months ago when I did the video on Chilago, and other people were doing were talking about it, which was the original capital of America before the British won the war. And you could go online and just click in Chilago and it would drop, you'd see ancient maps of it and pictures. Well, now, today, when I went into Google and tried real hard to find that map again, and I couldn't even find it. If you put Chilago in there, they keep directing you to Chicago. And you push, no, I want literally Chilago, and it just brings up nothing. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of shenanigans going on, and they don't want us to know this. But I am going to share some pictures and maps with you, what we have today, what I could gather just today in time to get this video put out. Just yesterday, somebody asked me if I could do a video on Joseph Smith, because I talk a little bit about Joseph Smith. Let me start by talking about this just a little bit, because this is going to be the segue into what we're really going to be talking about, which is a big subject, and it's going to blow your mind. But you've heard of Joseph Smith, and you probably think, how stupid. How could you believe in this quack, Dave? You know, because all you've ever heard is some guy come up with some golden plates, and he was a money digger or something, a treasure hunter or something, and he was some kind of a charlatan, and all the stuff you've heard. Friends, when you find out the true story, it's going to put all the pieces together. Joseph Smith, the story that you've heard about him is completely false. Everything you've ever heard. Because the only thing you've ever heard is what they've allowed you to understand. The same thing happens to just about every prophet that's ever lived. They try to obscure it, and they'll take out many of the precious and plain things and subvert it, and somehow or another it's so important it stands. People still have it. You can't get rid of it because people have books in their homes, and how do you go to everybody's homes and get rid of it? So what you do is you make fun of it. You make up crazy stories about certain visions that he had, and you tell people half-truths, and then you start this, you use these poor people that believed in something, not necessarily Joseph Smith. Yes, they did believe in Joseph Smith as a prophet, but that's not the whole thing. They had a whole history. They believed in Mary Magdalene. They were the patriots and the pilgrims. Vive la France! Do you know that all the wars that we fought were, well, they started off, first of all, France fighting Britain. So we've heard about the Napoleon War. To this day, people in France don't accept the fact that they ever lost that war. But then they had a war, a revolutionary war. And we had a civil war. In the Revolutionary War, we're taught that America fought the British and we won. We did not defeat the British. Yes, they won, but they weren't just fighting us. They were fighting the French. And in the Civil War, it was the South against the North or the French against the British. I mean, the British and the French have been fighting for a while. And after that one, after the Civil War, they took France as well. And so there is no more good guys in France either. And the last of these individuals that they martyred, and we'll talk about a guy called Eleazar Wheelock, who was the guy who started the Dartmouth College. He was a Freemason, but he was of the good guys in Washington. And all these individuals that were here in America originally were the good guys. But they started coming over, the bad guys from the York Rite up in Britain, and they did this Illuminati in 1776. They organized. See, 1776 has nothing to do with our country or our liberty. We had a constitution before the constitution that we have now. There's a lot that they don't tell you. They've kind of taken some of our liberties away. But in 1776, that is the date for the Bavarian Illuminati to be created. And that's when they started pouring into America, and they infiltrated and murdered Joseph Smith. And you'll find out why they murdered Joseph Smith. They also murdered Hiram Smith, his brother, and a man named Alvin. Now, the Mormon church has been taken over. Brigham Young, who was of the York Rite, who was a Illuminati member, he started this polygamy, wife-swapping, spiritual wifery, shenanigan, evil, deplorable, wicked stuff. And built this Gothic temple and brought all the Masonic symbols into Joseph Smith's work, ripped out that you shouldn't be a polygamist, and wrote another prophecy and backdated it and said that Joseph Smith did it. I mean, look, if you want to see the shenanigans that they pulled on Joseph Smith, they martyred him. Joseph Smith prophesied that they were going to martyr him in cold blood. He would go like a lamb to the slaughter. If his life was worth nothing to them, it was worth nothing to him. And as he went off to Carthage jail, and they murdered him. Well, they did to Joseph Smith. When you find out the history, and if you go back in that time and you see what they've been doing, these York Rite individuals came in, and they took over these 9 colonial colleges. Dartmouth was one of them. Yale, and these kinds of, originally these were the Pilgrims and the good teachers, the ones that were talking to George Washington and Jefferson, and they were going to these schools, and they were talking to the Indians, and that's the story we got with Thanksgiving. It's really real. It's true. These guys were good. The Dartmouth College was to help the Indians have learning. It was for everybody. Liberty and justice for all. There was no slavery there. Just like with Joseph Smith. He was an abolitionist. He was going to run for president. He was about to win. Now, the reason he was running for president is because this was the kingdom of the Lord, and they were divinely inspired to come here, Lady Liberty, and raise up the ensign. And they knew who they were. And they had these colleges, and they were doing this. And And they had their cities, and they'd been here for hundreds of years. But around middle of 1700, 1776, in this day time period, they came over here and literally started murdering people. One of them was Alvin Smith, who is Joseph Smith's older brother, who is the one who was literally more responsible for the bringing forth of the golden plates than Joseph was, because Joseph was just a young boy. Now, yes, Joseph Smith was there, and he was divinely chosen to be a prophet by the Lord. But so was his brothers and his father, and they were all part of the original Knights Templars that were by providence entrusted with the Holy Grail and the Holy Textus Receptus, and preserving liberty and justice for all, and bringing about the kingdom of Christ. So this is why they, instead of had war, they would build libraries and constitutions and Magna Cartas and things like this. And they came here and they had this place of freedom, and people were living in peace, the natives and everybody. All this part of the history we've lost. The British started funneling in and infiltrating, and one of the guys that was running Dartmouth College was John Smith, who was Joseph Smith Sr.'s uncle. And so these Smiths were involved in these individuals, these Knights Templars, and they weren't pretending to be some kind of quacks. They weren't money diggers. They weren't treasure hunters or whatever people say they were. They were literally looking for the original writings and things of the Knights Templars who had buried it there. Because Joseph Smith was like in 1820 when this is going on, 1830. And already the British had been infiltrating, and they were trying to preserve this information and defend America. There's a lot of stuff that's been burned and thrown away and manipulated. So they wrote this information down, this historical information that they had documented, the actual plates that was preserved that had the history of one of the tribes of Israel that had come over here in 600 BC. He was called Nephi. And I'm going to do another video on that too, because it's very interesting. We're getting into the astrotheology of the Book of Mormon. And when you go through that and you see that the Book of Mormon is as divinely inspired as the Bible, and that just as the Bible has all these layers and all this astrotheology and stuff intertwined, and as above, so below, and all these parables, so does the Book of Mormon. But the Book of Mormon is specifically about, see, the Old Testament is about the law and the old ancient ways of humans before we were spiritually advanced and under the new administration of Christ and love. So we got Moses, that's the Old Testament. The New Testament is about the Lord Jesus, and he brought this new covenant. And so that starts the dawning of the new age that started at the end of Aries. And we've come 2,000 years. And now we're about to go into Taurus. And that's going to be another age. And so this story of the Book of Mormon is the same story that's there in the Bible, but it's somewhere along the wilderness trek around the circumference of the Wheel of Rebirth. So Moses is way back, all the way back to 2000 BC. Christ is about, the New Testament is about the 2,000 years between when Jesus came and now. And the Book of Mormon gives us the astrological or astrotheology from about the time of Christ all the way 4,000 years in the future until we get into the kingdom and reach the summit of the summer solstice and reach the mountain of the Lord in his house. And I'll describe the constellations in Cancer, which is the summer solstice, the beehive, what that has to do with it, and the land of milk and honey, the Garden of Eden, and Mount Zion and all of that. We'll start with Nephi, who represents Orion. In Nephi chapter 16, I think he starts talking about how he's got a bow and he breaks his bow because he's a hunter. Well, that's Orion. See, and Orion starts in spring. So that's about the time that Christ came. And he's got two brothers, Laman and Lemuel. That's the good and the bad. That's Jimni. And they start giving birth, and they reach all the way unto the land bountiful and to the Lord's mountain. And he's told to go to the top of the mountain. It's just like with Moses going to the top of the mountain, or Jesus going to the mountain. Every time you do that, you make a covenant. So we'll talk about the astrotheology of the Book of Mormon, and that's important. And I bring it up here because I want you to understand that this book wasn't just some hoax that some young boy dreamed up who was 18, 19 years old. There's more to the story that they've subverted. His brother Alvin, his father, were originally Knights Templars, and they were here and they were preserving these ancient documents about a tribe of Israel, which is from Mary Magdalene, that came to America and was trying to defend the kingdom of the Lord. So we'll get into another video talking a little bit more about how there's a guy named William Morgan, and there was a lot of stuff going on about the anti-Mason party. The anti-Mason party were the good guys. They were not of this York Rite. They didn't want secret societies. Joseph Smith was against secret societies. In the Book of Mormon, it describes secret societies and how evil they are, and polygamy and how evil it was. And it explains what they were fighting. The devil was right on their heels. And they wrote it down in a book. All this history. It was divinely written. And it wasn't just made up. They were literally buried in the earth by certain individuals who came over from the Knights Templars and buried it there. We've talked about that in other videos. There's records of these individuals coming over here. And New York wasn't originally called New York. It was called New Amsterdam. And it was not called America then. It was literally called New Franca. Although America was a word that they used, I don't know if they had named some parts of it that because, or some people called it that because they were massacred in 1307. And so from there they went to a place called America and Plymouth Rock. And then they were shoved out to the Isle of Man, which is between Scotland, Ireland, and England. And from there they came to what we call today America. But that was only one particular group that came over, and they were the ones that brought these golden plates and buried them there. They were the ones that were wanting to rebuild the New Jerusalem. But these natives that were there already weren't just natives. There were also people that were living in Chilago and people who had been coming over from France for a couple of 100 years, and they had already had their capital here. So Joseph Smith wasn't a treasure hunter or some sort of diviner, or I don't know what people think he was, some kind of charlatan running around with a peepstone looking for gold. He wasn't just looking for gold, wasn't an idiot. They were archaeologists. They were working for Dartmouth College. Hiram Smith went to Dartmouth College, and their uncle, John Smith, ran the college. And the college wasn't like today, it's a college, you were making money. No, it was literally an actual arm of the Liberty and justice for all. It was to educate and to preserve. And it wasn't just for the elite, it was for everybody. It was that liberty. It was the principles and their values. And the men who were strong and courageous were hanging together. They were trying to go west and build bigger cities and get away from them. They were going west because they were coming in from the east and murdering people. They knew that liberty would eventually prevail. And so they were trying to make schools and roads and move west. And John Smith was in the department of teachings and archaeology and things like this, and they were trying to preserve the history of America. And so the Holy Spirit came to Alvin Smith and Joseph Smith Sr. and John Smith and Joseph Smith Jr. And in the original story, it tells you all of this, but they've tweaked these stories to make it sound fanciful and sort of ridiculous and like a charlatan. And they've said he was a polygamist, and they've made all these stories up. Some crazy kid, just some charlatan, and it's not the way it happened. These were the founding fathers that were trying to preserve our liberty and the knowledge of Mary Magdalene. And you can go through the history and read where Joseph Smith was aware that they were trying to kill him for years. That's why they were going to Nauvoo. Who were all these mobs trying to kill him? The same people that killed William Morgan, who was the one who started the anti-Mason party. They were trying to stop these people. Joseph Smith was sending people over to England, and the original Templars and the children of Mary Magdalene and the people of France were saying, "Oh, good, America is the land of promise. Let's go." And they were coming over here to see the prophet. And it wasn't like some crazy, fanatical fantasy or fairy tale. Why would thousands of grown men come to America to see some young kid that found some golden plates? It wasn't like that. They knew that their people, protectors of the Holy Grail, the Knights of Mary Magdala, had arrived here on ships and had buried this information. And this was the history, miraculously preserved by providence. And all of the people that were leaders of France, that were fighting against Britain, who were the German tribes, these 10 German tribes, that the Bible says the book of Revelation ends up making a one world government. You will comply, Klaus Schwab and all of these guys. They are trying to root this knowledge out and destroy this information. So they took this wonderful Statue of Liberty and the Constitution and twisted it and turned it into some crazy, insane stupidity that sounds like, oh, it's because the British lost and we won. But none of that really actually happened. They let us go on thinking we won. But in the meantime, they were infiltrating all of the county seats and all of the positions of power and rigging the elections and doing all of this and taking over all of our institutions and creating the Federal Reserve and this kind of thing. And because they couldn't destroy and stomp out freedom just in a foul swoop. It took them some time. The war between France and Britain didn't just end in the Civil War. It's still going on today. And the Sons of Liberty are still standing strong. And I hope you're one of them. Friends, our flag is red, white, and blue. And those are the colors of France. And yes, Britain has some red, white, and blue on their flag. But you see, it was Jesus' descendants, Mary Magdalene's descendants, Marseille, France, is where she landed on the boat with Jesus' son and 2 daughters, and Lazarus and the 72. And they made a kingdom called the Languedoc, and it grew into France all the way up the Rhone River up to Paris. The Albigensian, Waldensian Inquisition was the Catholics that had now been taken over by the Germans, destroying and taking out the knights until in 1307, on Friday the 13th, they had the big massacre and massacred all the Knights of Mary and the Knights of St. John and the Templars. And they infiltrated. In 1776, they made a new organization in Bavaria called the Bavarian Illuminati. And that's the Illuminati that runs the world today. Now, the Templars and the Knights of St. John, these groups, were all taken over and infiltrated by the Illuminati. But when America, in 1776, made the Constitution, individuals like George Washington and some of these that you've heard that were Masons, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they were Masons and they were good guys. So we've said then that they came over probably around 1308. We have documents now that they've dug up that indicates that there was a group of individuals and pilgrims that came here in about 1308. They started the areas up around Oak Island, up around Nova Scotia, and all the way down to New York and through Vermont and that area. And from there, they made cities and towns and were growing, and they became the 13 colonies. But it isn't exactly as smooth as what we're told, as though they just landed in 1620 on Plymouth Rock. They were here from 1308, from what I understand. That group of people that we call the Founding Fathers and the original Nova Franca, Nova Scotia. And the Spanish were here too, before the British were here. So most of the United States and Canada was all owned by the French. And they had the best areas, the coastal areas. They hadn't gone much inland. I mean, they were probably farmers and so forth, but there was no cities inland. They were along the coast. It was a large area from Nova Scotia all the way down, and of course around the Great Lakes. And this is why they ended up making their capital. They pretty much stayed around the Great Lakes. They landed in that area up around Nova Scotia and went to the Great Lakes and made their capital at Chilago. And I'm sure that they had colonies all the way down Virginia, and I'm sure they had commerce with peoples. Like I said, there were people from Spain that had landed in Mexico for hundreds of years, and we know about Coronado, and he was exploring all over Mexico and Western America too, looking for the 7 cities of gold. So there were different peoples that were here. But in those days, they knew about each other. They all had maps. The sailors weren't unaware that the Spanish were down there. When the Vikings came over, they knew that we were already here. But what they did when they got over and they wanted to take over this beautiful paradise and stop Satan controlling it. They wanted to stop the progress of freedom and liberty, because then their families and their genealogies and their royal bloodlines wouldn't get us as slaves anymore. They had to keep us down, keep us ignorant, and they wanted to rule over so they could make all this money. And they would sell us tobacco and poisons and whiskeys and keep us stupid and as slaves. And then they used this as brute slavery to go and tame the wild, wild west and build more cities. It's a never-ending kingdom of evil for them. So they were here in 1308. We don't know when they established their capital. We don't know when But we do know that in 1800, Chilago was a very large city with, it was a mega city. There must have been millions of people here already. Now, the group that came then in 1620 met others that were here and knew about them. In those days, it wasn't any secret. Now it's just been kind of hidden. There's ways we can determine this information, but it's not readily taught in the schools that they were already here and that their capital was in Chilago. So when we get the story, most of what we're getting is around the time of the founding fathers. They knew also much more than what is being reported, because remember, all of them were building places like Monticello and Montpelier, Jefferson and Madison and so forth. They were French, Thomas Paine, these people. This is what made the Constitution. The fraternity and liberty, this came from France. And these came from the Knights, not from Bavaria that took it over. So they had colleges, Dartmouth College. They had 9 colleges. This included Yale and all of these. But they've been taken over by the York Rite from the northern climates, the Vikings, when they came over. The Vikings were a different group. So if this group of people, they knew their history, they knew who they were, they knew about Chilago, why would they not mention it? Did not George Washington mention Chilago? Well, remember, 1308 to 1620, that's a long time, that's 300 years, and those primitive times, they were primitive. They didn't have phones and internet. They didn't have a lot of libraries and books at the time, so it could be a 10-year period, and you could just pretty much wipe out certain ideas and knowledges of things. One way you do it is you burn it down. This is how they got rid of the Mormons that knew about Joseph Smith. They didn't just leave and go to Salt Lake and kill the prophet, but they killed the prophet's brother. They had been systematically trying to get rid of them. That's why they were going west. That's why Joseph Smith was going to Nauvoo, Illinois, and in far west Missouri, to get away from these guys. Who was after them? The York Rite Brigham Young group. So Brigham Young sent people back in 1871 to burn that area out. That was the Chicago fire, and it wiped out the evidence of Chilago. Brigham Young had no business being he was not any part of Joseph Smith. He came in, and as soon as he got there, Joseph Smith went to jail. And then they started backdating supposed commandments or prophecies or whatever from Joseph Smith, claiming it was from him. Joseph Smith denied all of this. His family, his wife, his children, all the original Mormon people denied Brigham Young and didn't go with him. Well, Nauvoo, Illinois is where a lot of them were, about 70,000 of them. Not very many of them went to Salt Lake. Almost none. Only the only ones that followed Brigham Young are all these York Rite people that had been flooding in from Britain. Not these faithful, individuals, Harrison and Rigdon and Cowdery and these guys that stayed loyal to Joseph and Joseph's children and his wife Emma. They didn't go to Salt Lake. Where did they go? Well, it was 40, 50 miles away is Chicago. They didn't really go anywhere. But when Brigham Young got over there, she was telling everybody that he was a fraud and exposing him and proving that there were no children. Joseph Smith had no intercourse with any other women. And everyone signed affidavits. Joseph Smith put his hand on a Bible and swore he was not a polygamist and never would be. So if you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, you Mormons, then you have to believe his testimony that he was a man of honor, that he would never lie and perjure himself like that. He wouldn't be a prophet then, would he? And you'd have to deny your entire organization. If you believe in Joseph Smith as a prophet, you have to believe that Brigham Young was a false, evil man leading the church to hell. bringing all this masonry and stuff into the church, secret societies that Joseph Smith railed against and condemned. He condemned slavery. He condemned all of these secret combinations, and because this was what was prevalent going on right now. And John Smith, his great uncle, and his brother Alvin, they were trying to preserve these things and gathering the other pilgrims and saying, let's get out of here. They're trying to kill us. Anybody who knows the truth about Chilago. And yeah, he said, well, they didn't know about Chilago. Yes, they did. Joseph Smith went there and said, look, this is Zarahmla. Well, what is Zarahmla? Well, it's right there. And not too many, like I said, it's all in the same area. It's kind of on the tip of Iowa and just not far from Nauvoo, Illinois. And this area, Joseph Smith was very sure, was a place called Zarahmla. Now, Zarahmla was the original capital city of, well, originally there were several groups that came over, spoken of in the Book of Mormon. One group, the earliest group, is the Jaredites. They came over from the Tower of Babel. We don't know exactly where they landed or anything. We don't know where they landed. They might have landed in Central America. That's where the currents lead you normally. If you leave from the area around Israel, the currents in the ocean will lead you from Yemen across the Pacific to Central America or Chile. And in fact, we know that Lehi landed in Chile in the town called La Serena. Today is what it's called. And we know that because Joseph Smith had a revelation on exactly where Nephi landed, and he said that, Nephi, yes, but it was his father Lehi. Nephi was his son, and he had another brother named Laman. So they came over in 600 BC, and we know where they landed because Joseph Smith told us, and he had a revelation, that they left Jerusalem going southeast through Saudi Arabia, and then came to a place called Nahom and turned and went directly east over to Yemen. And from there they sailed southeast. That would lead you across the ocean, across the Pacific, and all the way to Chile, when he says they landed in La Serena, Chile. Now, if you go there and you look at the ancient ruins and things, you'll find that there were people in Chile and Peru. They've got archaeological sites that might date from the Tower of Babel, after the Tower of Babel, about 2000, 3000 BC. Well, that's interesting because that's exactly what the Book of Mormon says. The first people came over here was the Jaredites. They came over from the Tower of Babel. Well, they must have landed somewhere just very similarly as Nephi in Central America or Chile or Peru or somewhere down there. And they branched out over thousands of years, different groups and peoples. We think they were probably Mongoloid type individuals. There's a lot of statues and stuff in that area, in those older places. And of course, they were interbred with other groups that came over. So the Jaredites were here from the Tower of Babel. And so, but now Mayans and things like this, and Incans, Olmecs and Toltecs and these groups of people, they're more modern. We're told that Nephi came over here in 600 BC, and he was wiped out. Most of the Nephites were wiped out, and they were gone 400 or 500 AD. Well, how do we know that this is just some kind of a story? Well, the whole history's there. You know how I'm always talking about the Enochic land? Why would it be called Enoch's land? Because these were Hebrew peoples that came here. The people that we know as Toltecs and Olmecs and Aztecs and all these individuals, Incans and Mayans, and all were after Christ. You know, we only have cities like 400 AD and stuff like this, even after the Nephites were wiped off the face of the earth. So the Nephites were before, not the Jaredites, 3000 BC, but they were before a lot of these others. Well, again, you're never told any of this because they don't really want you to know the Book of Mormon's true, but it's all verified. We know that the peoples that lived before the Olmecs and the Toltecs and the Aztecs that were here 600 BC on down and became the family roots of all of these other groups were called the Nuhas. And the Nuas, or, sometimes they'll spell it with a TL on the end because everything like Quetzalcoatl, right? Or Inoktland. This LT sound is from this original group of people called the Nuhotl. This is how it's spelled in English, Nuhotl. But the tol is just all silent. So it's Nuha. And that's the hua is spelt with the PH, fua, which is silent. So Nephi and Nuha. And we know this is true. Because if the Book of Mormon is true, then the people who were the founders of all these groups in Mexico and that area had to have been named Nephi. Well, sure enough, the people, whoever these Nuha people were, all the towns and cities are named something Nuha, and they've interpreted this to understand that this is the city of Nuha, and this is the people of Nuha, and these were the languages of the Nuha. And so the Nuhatl, are the peoples that have come down and they've inhabited all the way from Guatemala all the way through Mexico and became the ancestors of the American Pueblo Indians, which we call Navajo and Zuni, Hopi type Indians. The ones that live right around me where the 7 cities of gold were and the Coronado was looking for. So, now you guys remember I was telling you about Carlos Castanedas, who wrote the book, who was a disciple, who became a disciple of Don Juan, the last of the Yaqui shamans. Now, the Yaqui Indians there's a lot of words in their languages like Yahoo, Yaha. And this literally comes from the Hebrew Yahweh. There are tribes, the Yaqui Indians, that go up through California. Those individuals, they found in the gold rush days, they captured the last of these Native Americans that were there in Northern California, in Butte County. They tried to communicate with him. They couldn't figure out his language, and they sent linguistics and specialists and stuff in from universities and stuff around. And they finally figured out that he spoke perfect Hebrew. They finally got him to say, when they were trying to ask him his name, he said, Ishi. And later on, when they understood more about what he believed in his language, and they were able to speak with him and stuff, they realized that he wouldn't tell them his name because you don't ask, in their culture, you don't ask their name. But he could say, I am Ishi, which means I am man. And in Hebrew, that means man. So if you look at even the names of the tribes that Ishi came from, the Yahoo Indians, and these are related to the Yaqui Indians down in Arizona. They came up from Mexico. Well, other groups went into New Mexico and Colorado. They also speak Hebrew. We know that they're the same family of natives that were also there in California and Arizona, based on linguistics and so forth. But we also know they spoke Hebrew because up there in Colorado, there's the Purgatory River, and along the canyon walls, you see Hebrew writing. This goes all the way down through New Mexico. They find, amongst all of the pictographs, they'll find little Hebrew letters written on the rocks all the way through. We also find Hebrew letters and writings back east, which I'll get into another time. But all of these Native Americans that were here in the 1800s go back to what they call the Pueblo, and the Pueblo Indians went back to this Nuhatl, which, again, some of these letters are silent. It's the same as our Nephi. They were called the Nephites. So Lehi landed with Nephi and Laman and his wife and children and his family in Chile. And now remember, the big, huge temple you've probably seen, Machu Picchu, whatever there it is called, in Peru, that wasn't even that old. That's like after Christ, 500 AD or 1500 AD or somewhere around there. So Lehi and Nephi and Laman didn't build that. But the peoples that lived in the area before that came from a certain people, and that's the Nuha, or the Nephites. So Incas and Mayans may have came from that, and they have been a mixture of them, as well as the Jaredites that were there from the Tower of Babel. But the story of the Book of Mormon is that when Nephi came, he built the city. So he probably went up to around Guatemala and began to build cities, and their major city was Inocticlan, and that's today known as Mexico City. And from them came various divisions and splits and tribes. We get Aztecs and Tolmecs and Olmecs, and this led to the Pueblo Indians that were in North America, up in Colorado and California and Arizona. But if any of you did go and check out the teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castanedas, his disciple, who became his disciple so he could learn all of these things and write them down for posterity. Well, he writes in there that he was the last of the Yaqui, as again, this is this Hebrew language, and he was of and spoke the language of the Nahuatl, which is the apparent language to the Pueblo, the Olmec, the Aztec, and it's the sacred language of Nephi. And so he held the priesthood in a continuous line back to Nephi, but also through a line called Mulek. Mulek was another group that the Book of Mormon talks about that came over to America and also lived in the area up around North America from California all the way to the East Coast. But the Nephites landed in Chile and then expanded up to Guatemala and Mexico City and built their civilization there. But the Book of Mormon says they became very wicked and evil. And so the Lord raised up a prophet called Mosiah. And he led some of the Nephites, the righteous Nephites, northward. And they went up into North America to a place called Zarahmla, which was the capital city of the Mulekites. Mulek is like our Hebrew word, because they were Hebrews too. They came over from 600 BC, and they were descendants of Zedekiah the king. So they were of the royal bloodline, and that's why they were called Mulek or Melech, which means king. And it's also a word that goes back to the Canaanites, because as you know, Judah married Tamar, the Canaanite. So the Canaanite Melech, or the Melchizedek priesthood, was there in America at Zarahmla, which Joseph Smith pinpointed for us in the tip of Iowa, not far from Nauvoo, Illinois. And it's not very far from Chicago. And this was the great capital of the latter Nephite kingdom, which merged with the Mulekite kingdom. So this is what the Book of Mormon's about. But now, if these individuals like Joseph Smith came over here as pilgrims in 1308, how did they know anything about these Native Americans? Well, they were all children of Israel, and the true deity, Jesus Christ, who built the city of Inocticlan. That's why they call it Enoch's land, because they were Hebrew peoples. And they had this information, and Jesus was watching over them. In fact, their story of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is the story of Jesus in the days when he died. And we know this because the Book of Mormon tells us that Jesus Christ came and preached to the people of Nephi that was there in Mexico before they left and went to Zarahmla in the area of Illinois and Iowa. They fought their last battle at the Hill of Cumorah, which is in New York. So Jesus came and said he preached them, and then left on the clouds of heaven and went east into the mountains and said he would return from the east again. And this is the legend of Quetzalcoatl. And you read this, only reason we even know this is because when the inquisitors came over or whatever from Spain and conquered that area and Coronado, they massacred them. Many of them were just completely massacred, the native peoples here. And they got together with one of their shamans or whatever down there, and from what he knew and could compile from their sacred books before they murdered them all, they wrote down their history, and he wrote what we know as the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh gives us the entire history, just like the Book of Mormon tells us, and explains that their prophet, Jesus, or the Christ, who would return in the latter days as the second coming of Quetzalcoatl. Well, that just means the feathered serpent, and we've talked about that even in our Bibles. So, this spelling, Quetzalcoatl, is a Nuha language. The Nuhatl, because they always had the TL on everything and it's silent. So it's Quetzalcoatl. And we know then that Quetzalcoatl and Enochtitlan come from the same language. And we know what language this is. It's the Nuhatl language, which is the language of Nephi, the Nephite language. It's a sacred language. And this is the priesthood that was preserved by Don Juan. He was the last of the Yaqui Indians who preserved the Nahuatl priesthood. He handed that on to my teacher, a man that I lovingly refer to as Rusty, that I met in Idaho when I was there at 18 years old. And of course, that's where I ended up just after I was disfellowshipped, excommunicated from Jehovah's Witnesses, because my father grew a beard and I didn't want to be quiet about it and just not say anything about the fact that they murdered my family and literally murdered my mother by making her very sick and destroying everything I knew. And so they disfellowshipped me, and I was just turned 18. I went up back to northern Idaho, and that summer there was a big fire in the town of Bonners Ferry, and I went and got a job fighting the fire, and that's where I met Rusty. And so Rusty kind of took me in. I was kind of confused and no direction and searching and praying, and the Lord sent me Rusty. And he taught me all about the spirit and what the Lord really is and how to leave your body. And he told me about all the things he had done, and his teacher, Don Juan, of the Nahuatl Indians, that goes back to the Quetzalcoatl tradition of Enochtitlan. So, if Joseph Smith came over in 1308 from France, I mean, his ancestors, how did they know anything about all these peoples? Because they were all children of the Lord Jesus, who, if you read the Book of Mormon or the Bible, you would find that this American continent is the promised land that Nephi was sent to. The native peoples here, these are the children of Israel, a branch of the children of Israel from Joseph. And there is royal bloodlines from Judah that were placed here as well. But the angel chose the pilgrims that were there in New York and told them to preserve these things. That's why Joseph Smith preserved the golden plates and this information, and they hid them back up in the earth, because if they had not hid them, these evil, wicked, satanic peoples, these York Rite Illuminati, would have destroyed them, and you just don't give your pearls before swine. So this information had to be preserved. So we got the Book of Mormon so that we would have an idea that these people that are here are the children of Israel. And it explains a lot of the prophecies and makes sense out of a lot of the things that was written in the Bible, and the promise that was given to Joseph about his branch going over the wall and becoming fruitful, and the Gentiles becoming in, and all of these things that we've talked about. And Joseph Smith then gave his life to bring these things out and to restore this information. The restoration of the gospel is the restoration of the books and the history and our roots and who we are as a people. And friends, that was only the beginning, because Joseph Smith went into some very holy areas and made some very holy prayers and prophecies that are now coming true. The restoration of all things, that the stick of Ephraim will come forth and become one in our hand with the stick of Judah. And that is that all of the 12 tribes and all of their information and their scripture, which is the restoration of their culture and the knowledge of who they are, is coming to light. So it looks like we're over an hour. I'm going to probably just leave it there, guys. I hope you guys got something out of this. I couldn't really cover it in depth because there's so much that we could cover. I probably should do another video or two on this history, because I know a lot of you don't understand what the Book of Mormon's about and who the natives were and what they're called. And, you know, because some people think, well, wait a minute, was the land of Nephi in North America? Was it down there in Mexico? Well, they originally came over and started a kingdom, and that was in Mexico. But they became evil and wicked. And so the righteous group of Nephites that the Book of Mormon speaks of, they were led by Mosiah to go up to North America, up around the Great Lakes, and they merged their people, the Nephites, with the Mulekites. And so then the last part of the Book of Mormon and certain parts of the history there is about North America. And that's why when Joseph Smith came to that spot, he says that's where Zarahmla is. So a lot of Mormons get confused, because if Zarahmla is in North America, near Iowa and Illinois, how could Nephi have landed in Chile? What they don't understand is that the Book of Mormon talks about things in a very accurate way, just like our Bible, but yet we may misinterpret time spans. So as I've said, Adam in our Bible, it says he lived 930 years. It's probably more like 930,000 years. If you look at the Book of Jubilees, we've talked about this. In those days, they didn't use a year always in the same way that we do. Sometimes the word year in the Bible can refer to a year or another. Some people say it's an indefinite period of time, but I don't believe it's indefinite. It's a much longer period. It's an age. And so this is the same thing we find here. It's an oversimplified story in a parabolic form, the Book of Mormon. It's telling us the history of the entire South American, North American continents from 3000 BC to our day. The Nephites were only one group in that mix. And they started off, yes, hundreds of years before down in Mexico. But the Book of Mormon tells us that they migrated north and became one with the Mulekites that were in North America. So there's a lot that I'd like to share with you on this and history. I'm fascinated with the area I'm in now, because I believe that the original Nuhatl Indians down in Arizona and Nogales, where my teacher lived, all of these Indians, as I know from firsthand source, are these Nuhatl Indians, and this is the Indians of the Nephites, which did eventually go over into Iowa and become the peoples there. But there was a time where many of these individuals like Mosiah and King Noah and stuff lived further west here where I am at. And like I said to you guys the other day, I'm living in just, I don't know how many miles, I haven't looked on the map, but it couldn't be more than 20, 30 miles from me or less. One of the 7 cities of gold that Coronado was trying to find. And it's literally with the Zuni Indians. It is just down the road from me. So I have a lot of things that I'd like to explore and see around here. But I better go, guys. We're well over an hour. We'll do more on this. And hope you guys have a wonderful evening. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one. May the Lord bless you.